You ready, Regan?
Yep, already.
Great. Welcome everybody to this completion seminar for Regan Lynch's PhD research on queer nightlife and the potentiality of heterotopic space. I'd just like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on unceded lands, in my case on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are attending today. And I'm just going to hand over to Regan to give them the maximum amount of time and focus. Thank you, Regan.
Thank you, Yoni, and thank you everyone for coming by. Excuse me in advance while I wrangle the Zoom software. So also for everyone who just joined, I'll let you know that there is some embedded audio and video. So it should just stream through the Zoom software. So just be aware that that might be coming out of your speakers. For any audio, I've also included captions. So if you can't hear it, you should just be able to read it as well. So I'll get started.
Club spaces are political. They are inherently queer as well. They came from people like us.
I can be on the dance floor for like hours on end. So like, I guess for me, it is kind of a bit of like an outlet for, I don't know what, but like it's, I guess it is kind of like my exercise. It's like, it's kind of really nice and freeing, and just seeing a lot of people, it's kind of that culture and community as well.
I wanted people, the outside world, the straight world, to know that we weren't cute and like rainbows and butterflies. You know, I wanted them to know that we experience violence, we experience abuse, we experience, you know, no opportunities. And I wanted the grittiness to be seen.
You know, the club space doesn't stay within those, 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. hours during the weekend. It leads the rest of the weekday as well.
Even if we're confronting the darkest of things, that queers are amazing. Like relishing almost in a shamanic way in pain and darkness. Maybe relish is the wrong word, but confronting pain and darkness in a way that can still resonate joy and make people feel connected in their divine difference. Like for me, this is a space that's, constantly asking of us to keep on unfurling open our hearts and be okay in the mess. Like, I hope that's what people get from those spaces, like a sense of solidarity, a sense of possibility.
I hope everyone heard and read that okay. So nightlife. Nightlife has a almost mythical significance in the queer imaginary. When I tried to think of where my interest in nightlife began to write this presentation, I noticed that even from childhood, its promise and potential had partially captured the way that I would envision a future where I was liberated from the fears and anxieties of the present. Before I'd even considered gayness or queerness or sexuality, I'd feel this glimmer of something with each incidental nightlife encounter. I was barely a teenager when I walked past the Beat Mega Club in Brisbane with my dad, who just gestured towards it and told me that that's where poofters go. I remember trailing behind him and watching that very tacky facade out of the corner of my eye, straining to look unobviously back as long as I could. I didn't know anything about queerness, but I knew immediately that I wanted to go inside. In the oblique and shallow references in pop music to freaks, to the dance floor, to the club, I invested an unexplainable interest. As young as 8 years old, I felt Nightlife's pull when I saw the cast of the Coyote Ugly film dancing to Blondie on the bar top. We had this bootleg copy of the soundtrack on CD, and I'd stand on my bed and emulate their sexy dance moves in secret. The allure of queer nightlife lies partly in these promissory effects. For the subjugated, it may become an avatar of hope for deliverance. In queer folk histories and literature, it is nightlife and its constitutive elements, performance art, dance floors, venues, dark rooms, bars, clubs, that set the stage for self-realization and revelation, for coming out and coming of age. Nightlife's language is laden with the wonder and awe otherwise reserved for the mystical or tales of science fiction. In Butch Queens Up in Pumps, Marlon Bailey argues that for ballroom members, performance is at once a means of altering their ways of being in the world and of creating an alternative world altogether. In Fabulous, Madison Moore says that the queer aesthetic opens doors to brand new dimensions, creating a separate space in the here and now, with queer clubs functioning similarly to portals. For Karen Drysdale, in Intimate Investments in Drag King Cultures, Sydney's drag king scene functions as a small world. Within the work of these writers, however, despite this language, they find that the promise of nightlife is imperfectly, incompletely, or not at all delivered, a feeling familiar to many nightlife patrons. It seems a betrayal almost, but by whom exactly seems uncertain. The club may be a chrysalis, but it's equally a gauntlet to run, where we collide with many forms of violence. Hence, the clandestine locales of queerness emerge as spaces of ambivalence and contradiction. For instance, Lam Hay in The Gentrification of Nightlife characterizes club culture as full of foundational vitality, of creativity, diverse expressive cultures, and countercultural transgression of established societal norms. Whereas in their introduction to a queer nightlife anthology, Kemi Adeyemi, Kareem Kubchandani, and Ramon H. Rivera Severa describe nightlife as sites of alienation that are circumscribed by normative modes of exclusion. It is within this ambivalence, where elation meets disappointment, where healing and transformation take place concomitantly with violence and regression, that I have situated this project. Although the queer utopic analyses of Jose Esteban Munoz, Jill Dolan, and others have grappled with the concrete mess of real space and real people, real communities, a utopic framework privileges the glimpse over the panorama. It inherently associates the traces of positive effect within queer spaces as the authentic and true sites of queerness, de-emphasizing the context from which these traces arise, riven as they are with contradiction and failure. In service of attempting a somewhat total theory of the party space, I move from utopia to its mutant philosophical offspring, heterotopia. Heterotopias are spaces that provide a glimpse of how it is to live otherwise. They are social, cultural, and discursive experiments generated live in space, taking forms that can't be fully predetermined. The terminology was at first a medical one, meaning body matter that is positioned abnormally, that is out of place. Michel Foucault translated this idea to the humanities in the 1960s, proposing in a lecture titled Of Other Spaces that heterotopias are a simultaneously mythic and real contestation of the space in which we live. Although the literature on heterotopia is too vast to cover here, and I want to move on to my own work, obviously, the most relevant development of the idea, as I've applied it to Melbourne's queer nightlife, comes from the work of Kevin Hetherington. In his work, The Badlands of Modernity, Hetherington proposes that heterotopias are spaces of alternate ordering, sites set apart from everyday society, where different rules, cultural values, and practices temporarily take precedence. Although they're not utopias, they are material spaces where utopic ideas may be put to the test. They are, as Foucault describes, fundamentally other spaces, and may be associated with the feeling of being somewhere else, of stepping through the looking glass, of unease or of revelation. Through Queer Nightlife, I've partly sought to investigate Hetherington's claim that heterotopias are almost like laboratories, that they can be taken as sites where new ways of experimenting with ordering society are tried out. Here, the stakes of heterotopic spaces are clear. Through their fraught, messy contestation, new modes of being in the world are created, and from there they may seep out, staging their own ideological interventions in the day-to-day world and potentially transforming it entirely, eventually shaping the dominant culture after the values first developed within heterotopic space. Although heterotopia's ambivalence is its primary attraction to scholars, the utopic glimpse remains for many the locus of their interpretation, the site where the value of heterotopia can be found. For my own work, I sought to evade this emphasis. Instead, I have tried to look to the total. Alongside the transformational and the liberating and the hopeful, lay the moments of friction, of sucking your air in through your teeth, of rage, of disgust, of disappointment, or of plain old boredom. Rather than seeing these moments as failures of a pure utopic vision, I propose that it is through experimenting with these conflicting and often unpredictable forces that we, as nightlife patrons, begin to develop our utopic sense. Within a queer context, it's through the combination of these moments and effects that we structure our notion of what queerness itself should be, something we subsequently begin to construct and summon back into the world. I'm just going to close the window because there's a massive truck outside. So, I'll go back. Within a queer context, it is through the combination of these moments and effects that we structure our notion of what queerness itself should be. Something that we subsequently begin to construct and summon back into the world through things like modifying our dress, the way we dance, the way we behave, the art that we practice, the arguments that we get into with other people, or creating events ourselves where we attempt to bring these ideas to fruition. This is what I've come to see heterotopia as. The ideological, almost existential, contestation of ideas in space, a rewriting of the rules that never quite lives up to its aspirations, yet incidentally often surpasses them, though in ways that could not have been predicted or planned. Within the structure of my thesis, I attempted to group what I observed to be the primary facets or modes of queer nightlife together into 6 main body chapters, which were chapters 3 through 8. With my methods and literature review and interpretive frameworks largely detailed within the first 2 chapters. I now want to give a brief overview of these chapters before moving on to discuss a couple of performance examples from within them. At the very least, I hope to communicate a sense of the breadth of meaning of these spaces for people, encapsulating affirmation of their sexuality and gender, but also far surpassing them as the only metrics of value for the understanding of queer nightlife. Given the variety of examples I've gathered, rather than linger too long on in-depth analysis or try to kind of cover the whole variety of examples in each chapter, I've selected some extracts from participant interviews wherein they reflect on performances that they gave within queer nightlife spaces. Within these recordings, a glimpse of the thoughtfulness behind queer nightlife sites can be seen. Further, they partially capture and demonstrate the interview methods with which I conducted the research. My method approaching this project could loosely be described as a nightlife methodology. And I say loosely because I've never seen that phrase before, so it's just something that I decided to call it. A method of researching queer urban subcultures that has emerged over decades of sociological research, but at an increasing pace since the turn of the century. Within Chapter 1, Queer Performance and Nightlife Methodologies, I situate this in its broader legacy of scholarship within the fields of sociology, ethnography, performance studies, and cultural theories such as positionality, intersectionality, and assemblage. In broadly ethnographic terms, contemporary queer nightlife theory is developed through an insider perspective, relying on the researcher's submersion within a culture to absorb embodied and effective knowledges, to engage participants ethically, to avoid inadvertent transgression, and to speak more authoritatively of nightlife subjectivities. In this vein, discussions contained within this project have been founded on a series of 13 interviews, portions of which you already heard at the start of this presentation. And I conducted those with DJs, performers, promoters, and patrons of Melbourne's nightlife spaces. I conducted them between January 2020 and September 2021. And further to that, I've drawn my analyses from attending literally hundreds of events and watching performances since around August 2017 up until quite recently. As my involvement deepened, I also secured spots as a burlesque performer and DJ on event lineups, and soon began producing a number of events of my own in Brunswick, the CBD, and Collingwood. In Chapter 2, Heterotopia, the Interpretation of Space, largely a literature review chapter, so I won't linger on it, but I attend to the spatial and geographic legacies of queer research, and I bring the concept of heterotopia and queerness and queer theory into a relationship. So taken together, Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 are the methodological framing chapters, and my goal is to bridge the distance between the affective sensitivities of queer nightlife theory and the deconstructive spatial models of heterotopia, in service of interrogating them mutually and proposing their symbiotic suitability for the study of nightlife. In Chapter 3, also, I'm going to go through these quite fast, so there will be time for questions at the end if you'd like me to expand on them, so I apologize in advance. In Chapter 3, Expression Without Harm, Creating Safe Spaces in Dangerous Places, I focus on some of the most visible practices, contentions, and debates within queer nightlife, namely notions of safety for patrons, of representation through diverse lineups, or of creating or holding space for marginalized people. Through reflection on queer nightlife strategies of exclusion, protection, solidarity, and disidentification, this chapter in part documents the influence of intersectional cultural theory on the practices and worldviews of nightlife participants. Race, disability, and consent also emerge as major focal points for interventions into alternative imaginings of what queer nightlife can and should be. The traffic jam metaphor of intersectionality mirrored in the jarring engagements of participants with the urban environment or performance. Conversely, the labor of performers, I find, demonstrates a productive kind of slipperiness that may lead proper categorization under an intersectional model in search of a broader solidarity between struggles, and subverts cultural and racial power structures as they are often replicated within queer nightlife. Which takes me straight to chapter 4, the outside comes in, or what makes a heterotopia work. This continues and also complicates what I kind of set up in chapter 3 by shifting attention from how participants or patrons are shielded from nightlife's outside to the modes of hierarchy, oppression, and violence that are invited in, replicated, or in some cases even exaggerated in queer nightlife spaces. This chapter begins to poke holes in the very notion of an outside and an inside that can at times feel so integral to the experience of nightlife, furthering a theory of heterotopia as essentially porous, and to chart these moments of imputation that result in harm, violence, or offense. Rather than contend that these examples point toward a failure of queer nightlife to create heterotopia, I propose that they are instead the sketching of its edges. The whiplash of harm and its errant onward effects not only provide insights into the alternative normalities and fault lines that structure heterotopic space, but are also performative events that are themselves generative of tangential ideas that take form in heterotopic relations. In chapter 5, discord, disorientation, disruption, I kind of circle around, re-encounter heterotopia through a slightly different definition, which is more tied to its detonative, deconstructive nature, kind of in a similar sense to how queerness is often framed as a kind of unknowable, undoing force. In this chapter, the concept of safe space that I articulate throughout chapter 3 is also interrogated. Through the utilization of affect, particularly disorientation, I find that performers and promoters seek to sensorially unfoot participants through strategies of destabilization, inciting fractures that leave patrons more receptive to profound ideological differences or new ways of being. These spatial eruptions revolt against the notion of safe space quite explicitly and suggest that the queer desire for protection or the wish to avoid confrontation can also be leveraged in the justification of gentrification. Although positioned aesthetically at the avant-garde or cutting edge, it is within these sites of disorientation, ideological fluidity, and destabilization that the legacy of nightlife's forebears, namely the experimental cultures of disco, punk, and house music, can most clearly be seen. Chapter 6, Back for Good, Cultural Memory and Heterotopic Virtuality, continues Heterotopia's reconstitution through the effectual. It looks at how memory is grappled with, constructed, and summoned into queer nightlife through dance, DJing, performance, and the relations between people. The liveness of the past is found to be key to why these sites feel different. And for marginalized people, they function as alternative archives for cultural history while themselves generating the archive. They also allow people who have suffered trauma due to markers of their difference to build new relationships with their personal history by recontextualizing it and themselves within a site of collectivity and affirmation. As the COVID-19 pandemic shuttered venues, participant interviews and a wave of virtual parties through Zoom made explicit how queer nightlife is founded already on this dialectic with the past and helped to enable a theorization of the ways that heterotopia relates not only with the outside world of the present, but it harnesses its meaning through a network of virtualities. In chapter 7, Blood, Sweat and Leather, the Ritual Art of Artifice, I interrogate the role of ritual and the spiritual in queer nightlife. The queer club, as well as heterotopic theory itself, are analysed in tandem as they are perceived as a kind of rite of passage. While I unravel performance encounters with rituality to propose that primal or pagan signifiers are leveraged to construct the effective nightlife mode of libidinous carnality. This troubles any neat conclusion on the ritual nature of queer sites, constructed much like ritual, as much through critique, campery, and irony as it is through any authentic belief, however you even can judge that. Understood performatively, these ritual performances can be seen as a generative ideological force that link queer nightlife with deep human histories and near pre-conscious human needs of behaviour. The heterotopic framework itself, having been challenged throughout these preceding chapters, is now threatened with dissolution as the categorical disturbances of ritualization reflect the performative force of heterotopic theory in constructing the relationship between researcher and subject, as well as the quotidian and the utopian. Chapter 8, final chapter, The Inside Goes Out, or What Happens After the Sun Comes Up. This returns from the fixation on the deep past of the previous chapter and instead looks towards the future. In a reversal of the porosity as examined within chapter 4, this chapter attends to the ways that transformative and liberative alternatives generated within queer nightlife are not contained to the space-time of the event. The heterotopic event is rather understood not as a membranous organ, but an ideological and effective surge which cannot be wholly contained, spreading to the street or innovating transformational alterations by increments in the day-to-day lives of participants or in the nightlife's afterlife. So I'll now take a couple of examples from each of the last two chapters, chapter 7 and chapter 8, and we'll also hear some words from the performers themselves about what their performances within queer nightlife spaces mean for them. So on the 4th of November 2019, Panic, the performance persona of Sevara Zaric, presented a hybrid performance art piece and DJ set at a party called Monstro. It's a Halloween party and it was on King Street. Before she started playing, 2 dancers took over the playing space in front of the DJ booth, setting the stage for her to emerge wearing a long flowing white headpiece, a matching outfit and large golden hoop earrings. She danced with a tambourine before with a gesture, instructing the crowd to part. She moved, dancing through the split crowd to a platform in the center of the room before dancing back towards the stage. When there, she kneeled and wailed, loudly enough to be heard over the music, and held a large knife up in the air. At this point, my friend beside me was gripping my shoulder so hard as to be almost painful, anticipating what they knew was about to happen. Drawing the knife back towards herself, Sabara ran it across her forehead. Then she hung her head down, wailing and hitting the ground, the dancers on either side still holding attention until she looked back up. It was not immediately clear if she'd cut herself or just mimed it until she stood up and moved towards the DJ booth. As she placed her hands on the CDJs and started mixing techno, shrieking, heaving techno together, blood just started pouring down her face. So I'm going to play some footage from that performance. It's phone footage, so it's not very graphic. But if you might be uncomfortable with the sight of a knife or of blood or of someone cutting their forehead, obviously please feel free to look away or mute the computer. It's just music playing in the background. The footage will run for approximately a minute, and you'll know it's over when you hear Savara's voice afterwards.
The last performance I had at Barber, for example, when I sliced my forehead, that was inspired by a really old ritualistic rite of passage that Roman Sinti people used to do back in the day, like years ago. We believe that every 25 years, almost like a puberty, like you're a whole different person. You, not even just physically, but also mentally as well, and even just inside, like everything changes, like your skin regenerates, it's just your whole different new person. It's almost like a rebirth. And where was I going with this? Oh yeah, so there was a really old tradition back in the day where all these like elders would dance around the fire, and you'd have people who are revered within the community of Romans and Sinti camps that would slice their forehead and wail really loudly to expel the demons of their inner body, because we can cleanse our outer body by taking showers and taking care of our skin, whatever, but it's harder to cleanse our inner body if you're not adapt to knowing your spiritual self. And that what I was trying to achieve during that performance as well. That being said, my birthday was near that day on the 24th. It couldn't, it made sense. I'm not technically 25, but it was the idea of it that really inspired me, if that makes sense. But it was really cathartic. Like I remember somebody asked me afterwards, they were like, didn't you feel it on stage? And I was like, no, I think I was just so in the moment. I felt a little bit faint. I think because I was bleeding all over my face, and I didn't even feel the blood dripping on my face either as well. And I wanted to do different things on stage as well, but I just was so wrapped up in what was happening. I didn't really think much of it. And then when I was DJing, I think only halfway through I realized that I'd blown my face. I kind of forgot that I sliced myself. And then I remember, I think because I touched my face and my face had dried up, that's from the blood. And I just winced for a second, and I was like, oh my God, what's in my face? And I'm like, oh shit, I just realized I cut myself.
I'm now just going to go straight on to the next example before wrapping up everything together. I might run a few minutes into question time because we also started a few minutes late, so I apologize for that. I'll try to go as quickly as I can. This second performance took place 2 years earlier than that, in 2017. That was the year the Australian Marriage Law Postal Survey was being unleashed on queer communities. I'm sure many of us here remember it, but I'll very quickly set the scene just in case. So despite the Australian Parliament's ability to change marriage law by just voting through sitting members, the government decided to send out a letter to every single Australian in the country with a yes or no question. Should the law be changed to allow same-sex couples to marry? By outsourcing this decision to the public, the government encouraged prejudice and queerphobic attacks by raising the profile of these positions as an equally valid counterpoint to those who were asking not to be discriminated against or harmed. Vindicating this bigotry had profound consequences. Sitting government members used their time in Parliament to promote hate speech, while religious organisations and neo-Nazis alike took to the televisions and the streets to express their abject disgust at queer people's existence. As Joshua Badge reported in the ABC in 2018, it was found that physical and verbal assaults against LGBT people doubled in the aftermath of the survey, accompanied by a dramatic increase in stress, anxiety, and depression within the community. On the 28th of September 2017, I was going through my Instagram stories when I noticed friends at Honcho Disco posting unexpected footage. What looked like a crowd of queers standing or walking outside the 86, with fleeting glimpses of performers Dandrogyny and Betty Grumble performing in the street. Following these brief virtual encounters, and after seeing several posts attesting to the necessary catharsis of this performance the next day, I got the sense that something profound had taken place.
So, speaking of taking up space, can you tell me about the time when you led all the patrons of the 86 out into the street
Yes.
to post your letter to the government?
Yeah. Well,
You explain, what the thinking was behind that and what led you to do that and
yeah.
what the experience was like.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was during the plebiscite, the yes-no bullshit that the government kind of brought into being. And I had collected my vote from mail at home and I was like, I need to do this thing, but I don't even want to open it. I just want to ignore it, out of sight, out of mind, which I often do with emails. And
Don't want to participate.
Right? Do not want to participate. And then thought, actually, the power of participating in a way that's very public and very kind of grotesquely and rightfully political and charged is what needs to happen. I was sharing the bill with my dear friend and collaborator, Betty Grumble. And I had this idea. I was like, what if we make that the act?
I love Dandrogyny so much. Such a poet heart, and really, because Dan always lets me stay at their pad. So I think we were in the living room thinking, oh, what are we going to do? Just a couple of little cockatoos squawking away. And then that was happening, which is why, such an act of violence by the government to do this. And we were trying to think about ways of acknowledging it without re-traumatizing the room and how you handle that, because people felt lots of different ways about even the act of doing the vote. And I guess we lent into our shared mischievous fairy clown energy. I forget who got there. I'm like, we'll just go do it with everyone, because no one has to do that action alone, and that's how we get through these moments. That community comes together, and it's not just your hand extending the letter, it's all of our big limb together. Because no matter what the result is, no one can actually take away love. And I forget what happened. I forget that it might have been the same that I did some pussy prints on top of the bar. It's all very blurry, but I remember jumping down off the stage, and I was meant to lead some of the crowd out with a megaphone, and we stopped the traffic and walked everyone across the street. And then I remember Dan kind of kicking the letterbox or kicking the mailbox, looking resplendent and glittering and tulle and fluoro, and then we just hooted and hollered and turning something that is quite grim and sad into a celebratory thing. Like, oh yeah, you want us to have to post on are we subhuman or not? Great, we'll just turn it into a party. Like, the defiance of that.
I wasn't there, unfortunately, but I saw it on social media, and I even saw people post about it the following day, and it really felt like people felt healed in some way by that. And that it was really important for them to experience that from, I guess, as you said, the violence that was happening in the lead up to it.
I remember stopping traffic, and dancing, but also that the cars were kind as well. Because it was instantly recognizable what was going on. It was a parade of queers.
On Smith Street, on any street. If there's any street in Melbourne, give us that one.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for bringing that memory back into my mind.
No problem.
Oh my gosh. Enjoy this trip. Oh yes. 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 Come with me. Oh yeah. Come with me.
So I'm just going to jump ahead to my conclusion in the interest of time, but I can speak about those more if you like in question time. So the contestation that characterizes the inclusionary struggles around queer party spaces is not only related to access or representation for those who are often denied it. As the experimental laboratories of culture, the eternal conflict surrounding these heterotopic sites is perhaps linked to their simultaneously destabilizing and reproductive ability, an implicit recognition of their at times unnerving capacity to catalyze change, regardless of the ideological form it takes. With this in mind, protests, call-outs, and campaigns from both within queer communities and from queer-phobic oppressors are more than mere territorial disputes over urban space. Rather, they are attempts to broaden or curtail the potentiality of the political. This process may not be linear, with the complexity and messiness of heterotopia leading just as often to outrage, trauma triggers, raids, and lawsuits as it does to solidarity, cohesion, community, and ideological replication. But it is precisely within the moment of these oppositions that the alternative values of heterotopia are rendered. Heterotopias may not make people exactly after their own image, yet the tide of their lasting influence is obvious within the everyday lives of those who engage with them. Despite their innate unpredictability, the leak of alternative social values into dominant culture designates heterotopias as sites that may always be central to anxieties over society's future, as it is within them that potential models for futurity take form, and they're tested in micro. In heterotopia's wake, the imaginative realm of the cultural and political is expanded, a sensational alteration of the ordinary, whose force cannot be sustained beyond its time and place, but that may incrementally incur into daily life through the efforts of those who have passed through and been slightly changed by their time within heterotopic space. Thank you.
Can we ask questions now, or? I was wondering, how does the concept of the heterotopia, how does that vary from Bakhtin's concept of the carnivalesque? Like, is it in the sort of the porosity of it that transfer to day-to-day life that you were talking about, or?
So the carnivalesque is kind of categorized as a type of heterotopia. So okay. It encompasses it, but I chose heterotopia because it leaves more room to maneuver, I suppose, as a theory that can encompass that that idea, but can incorporate kind of all of these other disturbing or dangerous or harmful notions of like hegemony and normativity and stuff like that as well. So yeah, that's the festivals are actually an example that Foucault lists in his original paper of heterotopia. And also, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Alison and Hannah for shepherding me through this beast. As they both know, it has been a journey. It has been a journey. So thank you both so much. I appreciate your help, and I'm tearing up.
I'm hiding in a little corner here and I can't get my AirPods to work, so my focus group is down there, so forgive me if you can't hear me, let me know. But I think just picking up on that, it's been quite an amazing trajectory over this, and Regan, I think you could tell us a little bit more about the design and the interviewing, kind of the decisions around interviewing, and how that kind of really that lovely symbiotic process you made of, you know, where you start and the interviews keep leading to things, and your readjustments throughout. I wonder if that's a very long thing to ask you to do, but I wonder if there's some response you could make to that.
Yeah, I guess almost the first year of this project was looking at ethics, because I began this project already deeply embedded within the community of people that I was studying. And so it's a large change of role, you know, going from someone who's just a friend or an artist to a researcher. And I was aware from the beginning that this marked a rather large power shift, because obviously I'm now an investment of the university institution, and thinking of the legacies of ethnography and anthropology and how they have, well, on the one hand, been a great benefit to queer communities, in that they have obviously provided insights into the fact that queer people are not evil deviants and have their own culture and their own point of view, but also on the other hand that there's just so much harm that has been done from university institutions researching on marginalized people, where that power imbalance has been exploited. So in designing the project, I just wanted to be really cautious that I was not taking advantage of the friendships and the relationships that I already had for personal gain, or you know. So I developed a very, I guess, rigorous ethical proposal, and although the research was still you know, it is based on my friendships, and the people who I interviewed, I do know them because of, you know, my personal relationships. But yeah, approaching them and obviously just being very clear about what was going to be done with their information, and interviewing them in a kind of separate time and place to the club, and you know, so that it could be, it's all just information that was given, I guess, under you know, a sober mind. And also yeah, moving into COVID, I started the interviews 2 months really before the pandemic first arrived in Australia. So a lot of those interviews were done through Skype or over the phone. And it was a very strange time because, yeah, obviously people went missing for months, like people were coping with what was occurring. And then when we did the interviews, it was, I mean, you may have picked up a little bit in those recordings. They became very poignant because no one knew how long the lockdown was going to last. And I conducted these interviews in lockdown. And so, you know, suddenly they became interviews with people who were reminiscing on this thing that had been taken away. And we weren't sure of whether it was going to come back. So, you know, there was kind of that undercurrent as well, which informed all of the interviews. I'm not sure if that answers that question.
I think it's great that you touched on the ethics and the ramifications around that merging of autoethnography and ethnography, and also the relationship of that with queerness and queer scholarship, and queerness's relationship with the institution now. I think that's very helpful actually for anybody else wrangling some of the same things in this group. You know, I think that's great. And your ethics, you know, was a really meticulous process, I think. It's great, and resulted in, you know, very particular conversations. We're always having these conversations with the ethics boards to try to push back a little bit sometimes with some of those things that actually don't necessarily work universally.
Yeah.
So that was, no, I think that was really good to touch on. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, during the ethics process, I decided to incorporate into the consent forms I guess the consent documentation for what's now called the Australian Queer Archives. So in addition to my research, the interview transcripts and the recordings are going to be donated to the Australian Queer Archives so that they're openly accessible to any other person, whatever their motivation, to listen to you know, because they're all an hour long, so that it's really only an absolute minute fraction of them that are featured within the thesis. So, you know, that just allows other people to gain whatever feeling or information they would like, and it's kind of, I guess, a gifting some of that research to the community for posterity. So yeah, and the University Ethics Board was a bit confused by that, but it was all fine in the end. We got there.
I actually had a question related to that, because I was so struck by how eloquent and evocative hearing the voices and seeing the footage, you know, how strongly they testified to precisely the conclusions you're drawing and the ideas you're presenting. And I was wondering what their status would be. I mean, apart from the archive, are they in the thesis or are they transcribed and described?
So in the thesis currently, it's transcribed and described. Yeah, so the thesis so far is all text. This pulling out of the recordings and sourcing some footage from friends that was for this presentation, basically. But yeah, I think you're right. Putting it together for this has absolutely made me think that, you know, that it would be quite easy to link to those things within the thesis so that people can hear those larger chunks of interview extracts that are in the body of the work as well.
It's also possible to write it up or to use the sort of interactive PDF format where you can actually embed rich digital format, which I think is very exciting for these, but it's probably a whole other ethics nightmare at this very late stage. But yeah, they were very moving. So I just felt that they just added several other layers of testimony. Are there any other questions? We might have time for one more, or comments. Yeah, Matt.
May I? Regan, I've such an interesting talk. Thanks so much. It's really a comment. I grew up in Darlinghurst in a theatrical family, you know, 60s and 70s. So I witnessed all of that, and what was then called the gay community. It was kind of normalized in our social set, and so what seems to be the concluding statement that you're making here, that the is heterotopicality a term, it transfers to the wider community and becomes a factor for change, is a powerful one, and it's kind of one that I've witnessed generationally. So I guess I'm just saying all power to you, because I think it's a really, really strong and quite a political project at base. So thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. And thank you for that comment as well. And I'd also just like to say that I think the important takeaway with heterotopic theory is its ambivalence. And obviously, when the radical becomes the normal, it can also become the hegemonic. And so it's about relational reading, and it's not necessarily saying that these things that we see as the alternative or the things to fight for in these spaces are always going to be radical. It's simply, I guess, observing and commenting on that relationship between these kinds of spaces and the dominant world, and I guess proposing a theory of how social change can happen through these kinds of messy experiments within, you know, small communities or spaces, and how that can influence the broader culture eventually.
Yeah, so important in these times.
Thank you so much, Regan, for a really fantastic presentation. It's just after 1, and I'm aware that people are under time pressure for all sorts of reasons. So I would just like to congratulate you and solicit a round of applause for marking this milestone with honour. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you, everyone.